The next panel is Happy Organizations, Compassion, and Organizational Flourishing.
Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for being here today. I'm Monica Worline. I have the privilege of moderating this wonderful panel to talk about organizational compassion and organizational flourishing. And I'd like to introduce our panel members in the order that they will present today. Our first presenter is an immensely talented and hugely impactful scholar who is a professor of management at Brandeis University and the executive director of the Relational Coordination Research Collaborative. She studies the way that coordination through relationships changes quality outcomes and efficiency outcomes. And she has so many studies showing such interesting findings that I couldn't begin to summarize them for you. Jody, Hoffer, Gittell will be our first presenter today. Our second presenter will be Dan Martin, who is an associate professor at California State East Bay, and you probably know him better as a visiting scholar at CCARE. Dan is an incredibly energetic person. I don't know how he does half of what he does, but I don't think he would mind me telling you that he is organizing a wonderful TEDx in Hayward that will happen on May 9th, and those of you who can attend, please make your way over there because Emma will be there and it will be a wonderful day. Dan is a social psychologist, and he is quite talented in taking things that people observe in organizations, in the world, in the field, and taking them into the lab and testing them and showing us interesting insights from them. Our third presenter will be Ryan Fehr. Ryan is an assistant professor at the University of Washington Foster School of Business. You will recognize Ryan because he's by far our youngest panelist. In fact, he told me this morning that his MBA students ask when the professor is going to arrive. But Ryan has had a very distinguished start to his career, including being offered the Most Innovative Paper Award multiple times for his division within the Academy of Management. He will talk to us today about some groundbreaking research on forgiveness and its impacts on organizations and how we might think of forgiveness less as an interpersonal construct and more at the organizational level. And our final presenter for the panel is Sally Maitlis from the University of British Columbia. Sally is an associate professor at the Sauder School of Business, and she's also a lead researcher in the research collaborative called Compassion Lab, of which I am also a member. Compassion Lab has been researching compassion in organizations since the year 2000, and we published some of the first empirical work on compassion in organizations quite a long time ago. So Sally's name will sound familiar from that groundbreaking work in compassion in organizations, and more recently, some wonderful papers on how compassion and caring practices enable teams to be at their best. And she will talk to us about the team level in organizations today. Thank you all for being here.
I'm thrilled to be here, and particularly to thank you for that wonderful introduction, Monica. But also to have the opportunity to follow the presentation of Mandy, who I'd never met before, who started with one of my favorite all-time quotes from organizational theory, Mary Parker Follett, something like one of the most important functions of business is to foster human development. And Follett said so many insightful things, and it's great to see her work being brought back to light, I think particularly in the context of this return to the relational underpinnings of high performance. So I started my work in airlines when I was a long time ago as a doctoral student at MIT, Sloan School of Management. And here's some of what I observed as I was out there in the field, observing what people were doing at Logan Airport and talking with people behind the scenes in the break rooms about what it was they were doing, because I honestly had no clue. And what I found was this very complex interdependent work process, the flight departure process, required a high level of coordination across at least 12 functional groups. Pretty distinct groups with their own kind of local occupational culture, and started to see real variations in how that was being carried out. And later went on to look at the same thing, sort of motivated by the fact that there I was in the hospital for the first time giving birth, started to see the same kind of pattern in patient care. Again, a tremendous coordination challenge. And this isn't even starting to get into the coordination that occurs when you're starting to look at the management of health and wellness over time in the community. This is, I mean, so you can start to see how much more coordination is even required beyond what is pictured here. But these challenges really intrigued me. I realized that frontline employees are not only important in terms of how they relate to leadership and the overall mission of the organization, but how actually they connect to each other every day around the everyday carrying out of their work. And wanted to really explore that. And as I started to look through my interviews and try to make sense of what I was learning, I came to the hypothesis that relationships were critical because they were shaping the communication across these work groups through which coordination occurred. And that this was happening sometimes in a kind of this positive cycle where those relationships between pilots, flight attendants, gate agents, ticket agents, ramp agents, caterers, and so on, mechanics, were characterized by a fairly high level of shared goals. We may each have separate jobs, but we see what it is we are trying to accomplish here together. Shared knowledge, meaning we understand how our work and the work of others around us contribute to this work process. We're not just kind of locked in our own little box. And mutual respect. We feel that what we're doing is actually respected by the work groups around us. And this seemed to be driving sufficiently frequent, timely, accurate, problem-solving communication when things went wrong, which does happen in any work setting. And what's the response? This kind of problem-solving response, which in turn seemed to reinforce those positive relationships. And I'll show in a minute how I went on to measure this. But often, it was a very different scenario, and possibly more often than that more positive scenario, both in healthcare and in airlines, where instead those relationships were characterized by functional goals to the exclusion of the shared goals, what Herb Simon might call sub-goal optimization, optimizing that local goal at the expense, literally at the expense sometimes of the shared goal, specialized knowledge without the benefits of the kind of systems thinking of how we're all connected here, and perceived lack of respect for one's work. And that seemed to be driving insufficiently frequent communication, often delayed as people didn't necessarily know who needed to know what and when and why, and inaccurate in the sense of not really getting the core of the message across that the other work group needs to know, and a resort to finger pointing and blame avoidance rather than problem solving when things do go wrong. And then again, seeming to reinforce that those negative relational dynamics. And I just basically called it relational coordination because when I first called it cross-functional coordination, people said, well, it's not really the way people have normally looked at coordination, so you better call it something different. And I think this was a good term, but I then went on to define it as communicating and relating for the purpose of task integration. So you can start to see how some of these relational dynamics that we've been really focused on so far today, another perspective on how they impact the work itself. And I went on to, of course, being a student at MIT, had to figure out how to measure, hypothesize, and really test some of these relationships. And so basically did a very simple network survey here across these work groups. And just a very quick kind of a snapshot of some of the findings, and that is in the flight departure setting, found that the kind of the risk-adjusted quality, efficiency, performance outcomes, turnaround time at the gate, employee productivity, on-time performance, and so on, were highly correlated with this index of relational coordination, and that this was a 9-site study across multiple months of operations. And you can see that one of my high performers was Southwest. I also measured not only their Chicago site, but their lowest performing site at the time, LA. And then you have American United with Continental sort of in there between. But it was, that was the dissertation, and I really was intrigued to go on and measure this in this other highly dependent work process, patient care, and found, again, a very strong correlation between the risk-adjusted outcomes that these organizations are trying very hard to achieve every day, reduced length of, risk-adjusted length of stay, patient satisfaction with their care, and in this case, it was a joint replacement surgery, so looking at the WOMAC scores in terms of their pain and functioning after 6 weeks after surgery. And if anything, even more strongly correlated than in the airline study. And this wasn't necessarily something people in doing the work, or certainly their top management, were really thinking about. I just thought one of the most honest kind of portrayals I heard, I was in the UK, in Newcastle region, talking to the National Health Service and one of their leadership groups, and afterwards an orthopedic surgeon came up to me and said, you know, I've read the papers in the journals, I believe the results, but it's very hard for me and my colleagues to realize it's not just what we're doing on the operating table that matters. It's really these connections with the other work groups, the nurses, the physical therapists, the social workers, the case managers, that is driving not only the patient satisfaction and the length of stay, but even the clinical outcomes that we care so much about. So it was an aha for them. So one of my question is, well, why and how does this work? And one of the ways of looking at this, I would guess you could kind of, that shared goals enable people to align their actions with each other, shared knowledge, you can see how your tasks fit, mutual respect makes you more willing to value the contributions of others and even to listen. So therefore, you're starting to affect the quality of communication that can occur across these work groups, and so on. And you can think about it actually enabling performance in two ways. One is kind of extrinsic, that enables you to get your work done more fluidly and easily because you're working in harmony rather than against a lot of friction from other work groups. And that's kind of extrinsic in the sense that, it allows you to get the work accomplished. But also there's this more intrinsic kind of story, which is there's something more fundamentally gratifying and about being able to do the work in this way, that the relationships themselves have a healing quality. And I think we've heard some great evidence to that effect. So I think it's that combination of extrinsic and intrinsic that start to explain what's going on. And the work's been extended to a lot of different settings. It's been particularly popular in healthcare, I think, given the tremendous coordination challenges and the tremendous potential for relationships to play a role in the healing process. And so some of the findings, just briefly, in terms of efficiency, employee productivity, reduced turnaround time, and that was true in product development and pharmaceuticals as well as airlines, reduced length of stay, reduced total cost of hospital care, reduced inpatient hospitalizations, even keeping people out of the hospital to begin with in a chronic care setting, reduced cost of chronic care, and reduced cost of product development. So those are some of the outcomes that kind of hit the bottom line. And then in terms of quality, just a tremendous range that really can't be captured here. But some of them really started to come up in Mandy's work because we did look at the long-term care setting as well. And that is the reduced error rates and the satisfaction of the family itself, increased patient intent to recommend, satisfaction with care, even increased patient psychological well-being when their family member was engaged as a coordinated part of that care provider team. And of course, worker outcomes, which we heard about from Mandy as well. The ability to, this is actually customer engagement, the ability of the family to become engaged in the process and become part of the care process. It was one of the really more recently explored aspects of this. And for example, in the early intervention, when you're trying to get infants and their families into care at a really critical point right after birth, it turned out that the relational coordination between the hospital and the early intervention agency was one of the most powerful factors found to make sure that that handoff occurred and that the family was actually engaged in care for their infant. The relational sensitivities of that handoff were tremendous, and this was an important factor. And then in terms of worker outcomes, I won't go too much into this because we've heard about outcomes for workers, but this notion of, these relational dynamics contribute to less burnout and emotional exhaustion even in work that is otherwise very similar for nurses and others. This is work that has a lot of emotional dimensions, but the positive support from one's colleagues makes it produces a kind of resilient response rather than burnout. So to get beyond that, I think one of my biggest questions really for today is how do organizations support the development and sustainability of relational coordination? Because we can imagine, and we've seen it so much in our own experience, where you sometimes get these positive relational dynamics, sometimes you don't, but how do organizations make it the normal way of how we do things here? And what have we found in that respect? And so I've looked at a whole range of organizational structures that have an impact. Most of these are found across multiple settings. Some were specific. The leadership piece was specific to my study in airlines, but I think it has implications elsewhere. So just a few quotes that help to put some kind of stories behind this. Our leaders communicate with customers and employees on every little issue. Their philosophy here is to take care of the small problems. When someone has a problem here, even if it might seem small, I have to take care of it. And so setting that role modeling by top leadership of this is how we do things here, and leaders kind of set the tone for caring and compassionate relationships was a really critical starting point for this. Another one, every organization has an opportunity as you hire people and as you de-hire people who are not working out to really think about what are we selecting for, what message are we sending, what is the psychological contract that we're even establishing here about what it means to work in our organization. And this was a comment from our highest performing hospital in the healthcare study that I mentioned. You've got to be a nice person to work here. We pick it up through their references. The doctors here are also sure to know someone who knows that doctor. Nurses like it here because physicians respect their input. This is the highest performing hospital in our orthopedic surgery study, and this was the chief of orthopedics speaking here. And then how do we resolve conflicts? Another opportunity actually to build relationships. And there's a lot of thought that goes into the overall, the organizational structures that you put in place, either at the high level or at the very front line for how do we teach people to resolve in a really productive way their own conflicts and turn a conflict into an opportunity to build a positive relationship. And here's one example, again, from one of our very high performing hospitals. And all of these were turned into measures of organizational structures, but these are that do predict relational coordination, but these are kind of examples that help us understand what these organizational structures are. Here's an example from Southwest. Each person here has a specific job, but part of our job is to help the other person. Then it's easier to work in a more efficient manner. So this notion that even the job itself can be designed in a way to have flexible boundaries, and then to have boundary spanners whose job it is to further connect work groups around the patient, the family, and the customer in order to create that relational context. And even, I just want to conclude here with the information systems, even information systems can help to create a more or less relational context. To what extent do we design the information system to reinforce the siloed thinking that may already exist versus create a visibility and a connection across all the people who are working with that particular patient, family, customer, or whoever that customer may be. So even something as kind of non-relational, perhaps we might think of information systems have a huge potential to be designed in a way that enable rather than fragment the connections. And of course, how we actually support our workers in their connection with their families and communities can further bring that energy back into the workplace in terms of highly connected employees who bring the connections and energy from their outside relationships back into the workplace and re-energize what we do here. So this is kind of that picture again, but the bottom line that I want to leave you with really is that organizations can and often do, but not as often as we could, deliberately embed these reciprocal relationships of shared goals, shared knowledge, mutual respect into roles. So it's not just, oh, do we happen to have it going on here in that kind of orthopedics unit or that neurology unit, but no, something that we've now managed to embed throughout the organization. So it's just the way we do things here, basically the culture of our organization, thus enhancing the sustainability, the scalability, and the reliability of those relational dynamics and the performance outcomes that go with them. And I'll just make one concluding comment looking at Kim here. When I look at the sustainability, part of the sustainability is how do these organizations then continue what they're doing in terms of these positive investments in relationships in times of severe crisis. And we looked together at what happened. Kim's looked for a long time throughout his career on layoffs and what is the implication of layoffs for the organization and how do they bounce back or even avoid the need to do layoffs to begin with. And so looking at the airline industry over 9/11, we wrote a paper on this together. We're able to see that the companies that minimized the layoffs had a significantly quicker bounce back to their pre-9/11 stock price levels and other positive outcomes that were able to come from that, but that they were only able to do that. One of the strongest predictors of the avoiding layoffs was that they had sufficient financial reserves ahead of time, and in fact that had often been their strategy to go against the Wall Street kind of thinking of high leverage to say, no, we don't believe in that, we're going to be prepared so that when things do go wrong, we don't have to resort to layoffs because we value the relationships we have here as a driver of our economic performance, and we're going to protect that by having the financial and other reserves we need in order to protect that through the ups and downs that we'll necessarily have. So this sustainability thing is not just building the organizational structures to enable you to embed relationships into roles, but even thinking in terms of your financial strategy of how do you create enough of a buffer that you can preserve those tremendously valuable relationships in a time of serious crisis. And that's it, and I want to thank you again for inviting me today.
All right, I've had fun interactions with Max before, so I'm going to go ahead and make sure this works. Ladies and gentlemen, it's such a pleasure to be here. What can I say besides, in all honesty, I'm probably the youngest person on this panel. It's just the stress of being in front of you has aged me very rapidly over the past hour. Having said that, I'm Dan Martin. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm going to talk about things from a slightly different perspective, going first from some of the basics of my background in social psychology into a highly pragmatic approach towards dealing with specific human resources issues that cut across organizations. So before we even go into anything, let's talk a little bit about the students that I work with. I work with students at Cal State East Bay. Cal State East Bay is a little bit different than many of the organizations that my esteemed colleagues work with in that folks who are there are usually first-time students. They don't have a lot of wherewithal. Maybe they're not familiar with the best direction to move in terms of school, so they get involved and engaged in their disciplines for a variety of different reasons, usually for the ducats, the cheddar, the cabbage, the Skrilla, if I may. So the point is, that's an East Bay term, sorry. Bottom line is, students get into this for a wide range of reasons, but we do need to consider where they're coming from. One thing that we find to a certain extent to be related to people's preference for going into vocations is something called social dominance orientation. This is people's preference for maintaining hierarchy in society. The really interesting thing about social dominance orientation is it's been found to be strongly related to things like sexism, racism, and a variety of other constructs that oftentimes we're not very comfortable with. The reason why I study this is because, honestly, the majority of my work up to this point has been done on things that are really not so pro-social, like discrimination in the workplace. So these things became very interesting to me for a variety of reasons. This ties directly into organizations because people who tend to score high on measures of social dominance orientation tend to move towards organizations that really do support hierarchies. So they're, in essence, looking towards being at the height of a pyramid and will do anything to get up there. It sounds familiar to some of the things we were talking about in terms of people being in a dog-eat-dog type of environment. So this is one thing that we need to think of before we get into it. What I've been looking at for the past couple of years has also been the relationship between people's preference for maintaining hierarchy in organizations and things like corporate social responsibility. Because if you think about it, who's going into leading organizations to run corporate social responsibility programs or to give the kinds of resources that are required to make sure that these CSR programs are actually effective and efficient? Who would it be, ladies and gentlemen? It's the people who are at the top of the organization, right? So we need to take this into consideration, but what we've found in terms of some research that we've done is that high levels of of social dominance orientation tend to negatively impact adherence to various aspects of corporate social responsibility. For example, in terms of ecological policy for the organization, perspectives on government regulation of business, the actual organization's philanthropy, the obligation to public, and it also is positively related to materialistic greed. So this is something that we're seeing in our own students. This really should come as no surprise. How many of you have taken an econ class? No offense, econ professors? Okay, so the older perspective on this, of course, is based on self-interest. We're learning a lot from other disciplines that this may not be necessarily a realistic approach and may not be something that is 100% accurate either. Obviously, we know that this could have significant impacts in terms of our own well-being and interactions with organizations, so it's something to be a little bit worried about. What do we know about health and well-being and social dominance orientation? Some other work that I've been doing recently has been looking at social dominance orientation and compassion. And what we're finding is that people who score high on these measures of social dominance orientation also score quite low on compassion for others, compassion for themselves, as well as increased levels of fear for others or from receiving compassion from others, for giving compassion for others, as well as receiving compassion for oneself. I don't know, that sounds like a fairly cold and heartless workplace. Would you agree? To me, it seems that way. They also suffer from higher levels of depression, anxiety, and stress. So this sounds very familiar to some of the work that my brighter colleagues have actually brought to bear today. So something we need to look at when we think about our students. What are we doing to help them understand the impact and the implications of this, and also to mitigate it potentially? Another interesting thing is that adherence to free market ideology actually plays a role in this as well, and seems to exacerbate the impact of social dominance orientation as well. And what do we think of in terms of economic self-interest when we think of ideology? That's exactly what we're thinking of usually, and this is some of the kind of work that people are getting put in front of them in business schools today. Not any of the great schools that are represented here, of course, but some other schools as well. So when we think about compassion in human resources, it's kind of an interesting question. How many of you work in human resources? In one way, shape, or other, right? Okay. Well, what do we know about human resources? Well, obviously, organizations manifest recognition of historical suffering through a variety of legal circumstances. We know that there's also other elements or venues for organizations to pay close attention to the needs of their employees, and some of our colleagues previously were speaking about that. But this is really a challenge for organizations, because when you think about it, an employee or a candidate for a position comes to you, and we know that not everybody starts off in equal places in our society. We know that not everybody has the same opportunities, and organizations, by virtue of the legal mandate of the EEOC, have to pay close attention to things like making sure that fairness is normative, and rightfully so, because bias can slip in otherwise. So this becomes an interesting question, because we want to think about how we can actually apply compassion to a much broader range of constituents than just people who are within our organization at any given point in time. So in other words, not just the current employees, but also the broader range of stakeholders within and without the organization. So a couple ways of thinking about this. Number one, we know what compassion is. We see this quite frequently in the workplace. This could be emotional support, providing time and flexibility, or other approaches. But compassion is absolutely critical for cooperation in organizations. I think many folks have stole my thunder already in terms of talking about this, through engendering trust, positive emotions, and really increasing the quality of interpersonal relations. So the question becomes, how can we utilize a tool that's already in place to affect change in any type of circumstance in any organization? The majority of organizations that you work with probably already have pre-established mentoring programs. Yes? In all likelihood, it's a normative component of a positive organizational environment. At the same time, it may not be leveraged as broadly as possible. So let's talk about some outcomes that are associated with mentoring and its relationship with compassion. How many of you suffered at earlier points in time in your career? Granted, right? That's why, again, I look so old. I'm actually 24, just letting you know. the bottom line is this. Mentoring does a great deal to ameliorate suffering in people at multiple points of the organization. When you think about an organization, you've got people who are trying to find their way up into the organization. You're also thinking about people who need to learn things from new employees, whether that's technological or interpersonal. So what are some outcomes? We know that protégés have more satisfaction, career mobility, recognition, and higher promotion rates. We also know that mentors have a great deal of career satisfaction, a sense of fulfillment, and the nice thing is that helping behavior is related to a wide array of positive outcomes like lowered levels of depression, having more personal happiness, etc. So what does this mean? A couple years ago, I started pondering this issue. And the real reason I started pondering this issue was because my students don't have mentors. This is a challenge for them because they don't know where to get mentors. Well, as I started looking at the literature, I also started realizing that there was no real good selection criteria for mentors, which kind of frustrated me because I'm sure many of you met your mate through some sort of internet-based, criteria selection. Just kidding, of course. Okay, but the reality of the situation is that people are using this kind of matching technology for a wide array of purposes. Why not do the same thing for mentorship? Does this make sense? Good. So what I did was I started to investigate this area and I validated an assessment tool to match mentors with protégés. Not so difficult. So started this out. It was previously called Mentorum. It's reached its second level with Clear Mentor, but I'll show you some pictures of this. This is at a university in Mexico, where I teach in Villahermosa. This is one of my students, Paola. You can see a couple things on the screen. Number one, of course, there's her picture. There's a series of mentorship outcomes. And what are these outcomes? They're both psychosocial as well as vocationally oriented, taking into consideration and keeping in mind that there's more happening within an organization than just career progression. So we're also thinking about the ability of an individual to deal with political situations or issues that involve interpersonal exchange. They're also gamed. So in other words, we give people credit for these types of things. It enables them to actually go ahead and try to get a good clue as to how they're doing, but more importantly, it tells their mentor how well they're doing as well. And some of my colleagues have alluded to the need for extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. That's provided by one component here, their reputation score. People can clearly see exactly how well they're doing, post it to any of their variety of social networks, be that Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn, most importantly. So if they do that, you can see they get credit for this instantaneously. Yes, the magic of computers could be in something like Facebook. My dear student representing the Pointer Sisters there. And then me with my choppy Spanish. I apologize for anybody who speaks better than me. The point that we're trying to get at here is that this is easy. We've known about mentoring for a real long time. Why hasn't anybody put everything together in one place to really facilitate that and then to establish the impact on things that are so critical to organizations like the emotional well-being of their employees or like the compassion associated with the organization internally and externally. So this gives you an example of some areas for people to develop their skills. Have you ever had a boss with poor interpersonal skills? I never have. It just never happened. So we don't give people the opportunity to fail as a mentor. We give them support. We give them ideas as to what they should be talking about. These things come from things like informational interviews, but they could be given protocols involving anything. There's been a great deal of work that I'm becoming familiar with now in terms of compassion-focused therapy, where some of these primes and some of these prompts could actually be inserted into these protocols to really facilitate in an unobtrusive way outcomes that are highly associated with a more compassionate workplace. So this would be an example of a protégé assignment. It's just talking about the things that you would expect people to speak about. This happens maybe twice a month for 30 minutes each time. Here's an example of a mentor assignment. It's people digging in deeply into their circumstances. And then you have the component that gives people the superordinate goal to actually compete with each other. If you think about it, many people are really interested in knowing how good they are. And this gives people the opportunity to see how well they're doing compared to other people and hopefully generate more interest in participating in bettering their community or their specific department. So there's a bunch of different ways people can measure impact. There's the very pragmatic business side of the house, but there's also, of course, the research side, which will involve the collection of data from a pre-post test and also from a manipulated perspective in terms of how people are doing in terms of health outcomes, how they're doing in terms of things like their criteria in performance appraisals. There's a wide array of different approaches we can take using data that's already available through things like the human resources information systems that are so normative in organizations. What have we been doing in terms of compassion research? This is ongoing right now. My students have been working with a wide array of organizations, predominantly associations. And these are professionals working with students, but we're also now validating an assessment tool that establishes the impact of this within the school itself. So graduate students to undergraduate students and senior level undergraduate students to lower level students. So we can look at the impact of mentoring on compassion for both self and others, both pre-post, the impact of individual differences on mentoring. This is set up to be essentially a tool for research as well as a tool to impact overall productivity within organizations. And let me just speed through this by offering thanks to everybody who's put this together. We've got the data collection going on. There's a bunch of other projects that we're working on right now that are pretty fun and fantastic. We're doing some work with Dr. Yotam Heineberg on self-affirmation and behavioral tracking. A little bit of work on transparency and compassion in banking with Bruce Kahane, doing some work on praise and its development with two wonderful people, Dr. Sapala and Matt Feinberg. Also, some work on pro-social and compassion mapping with CCARE and the Charter for Compassion. So lots of fun stuff going on. Please don't hesitate to get in touch with me if you'd like to chat about these things, and I look forward to talking with you later. Thank you.
So thanks everyone for coming out, appreciate it. I'm actually 50 years old, but I live in Seattle where there's no sun, so it's good for the skin. That's really what usually happens. So today I'm going to be talking about a time where I think that compassion is particularly difficult to enact, which is right after somebody harms you. So somebody offends you, you're really upset, and then all of a sudden you're trying to react in a compassionate way. And I would argue that this is particularly difficult, but also particularly important. So I started studying forgiveness about 8 years ago. A colleague of mine in my graduate school is studying revenge, more of a glass half full kind of person. So I thought, I'll study forgiveness. It seems like something good to do, stay optimistic. And I had a lot of good company. I was in a psychology department at the time, and there's a general feeling among clinical and counseling psychologists that forgiveness is a good thing. And so we have some people here who agree, Mahatma Gandhi, Desmond Tutu, et cetera, all saying that forgiveness is beneficial, that it's a strength, that it's divine. Then about 2 years into graduate school, got interested in business school, started walking across campus, and in about that half mile, all of a sudden I started hearing crickets chirping and tumbleweeds rolling through the business school, and I try to talk about forgiveness. And here's an example just of a business consultant who had talked about forgiveness and talked about how it brought up fears of losing trust, of losing control. The idea of anarchy actually came up. And so these concerns that whereas forgiveness is great in our everyday lives, it might somehow not be appropriate for the workplace. And so in the past couple of years, what I've been trying to do with colleagues, including Jay Narayanan, who's going to talk about forgiveness later as well, is try to say, well, what are some of the barriers to bringing forgiveness into organizations? How can we address those? And one of the first things we try to do is say, well, let's look at some of the effects of forgiveness to try to say, hey, forgiveness has sort of a lot of good things that it can do for people to try to convince that it has a place at work. So this is drawing mostly from psychology, and here I'm just talking about some of the findings we have from other people on what forgiveness can do. First, like we've heard about compassion, forgiveness can be very good for the individual. So if you have people think about times, and you can try it yourself right now, where someone's really offended you and you have not forgiven them, chances are your heart rate's going to start going up, you're going to start feeling stressed. And in fact, over the course of the life, people who tend to forgive have better health outcomes than people who tend not to be very forgiving, who hold a lot of grudges. So it has a lot of psychological and physiological positive effects for the victims. Again, like we've heard, about compassion in general being good for the individual. We also find that it has a lot of positive effects for the relationship. It's probably not surprising that we're more satisfied with relationships with people once we've forgiven them. One of the more interesting findings here is that when you forgive somebody, it actually on average makes them act more pro-socially toward you. So it's kind of the metaphor of forgiveness as a gift. When you forgive someone, they actually feel a sense of indebtedness on average that makes them more likely to help you in the future. So by forgiving somebody, it's not that you become a doormat that then causes them to harm you more in the future, but rather it can be effective in helping them say, let's move on positively with this relationship. And then there's some really interesting findings that have come out of the Netherlands that have shown that when you forgive, you also act more pro-socially toward people in general. So after forgiving somebody, you're more likely to donate money to charity. You're more likely to volunteer for a nonprofit. And so if you think about the idea of bringing forgiveness into organizations, people who forgive tend to be more pro-social. And we know that organizational citizenship, which is the fancy academic word for helping other people, is really good for companies helping them perform better. So if we can bring forgiveness into organizations, help people forgive more, they're going to be better citizens of that organization. Some of the benefits of forgiveness also become clear when we think about the opposite. What happens when we don't forgive? Two main things we tend to do. We tend to take revenge against people sometimes, antisocial response, and also to avoid them. Oftentimes people will say this idea of revenge as catharsis. So when I take revenge, it makes me feel better. And research has generally shown that this is a bit of what we call an affective forecasting error. So we think if you ask somebody, boy, would you feel better if you could take revenge against this person who harmed you? We tend to say, yes, absolutely, I would love to take revenge against that person. But then when they actually do, they actually feel worse. They tend to ruminate about it and think more about that person that harmed them. And it tends to make them more upset for a longer period of time. And avoidance, well, if you have a job and you want to stay at that job and your boss harmed you, chances are you're not going to be able to avoid them too much. So that doesn't necessarily seem like as effective of a solution as you could possibly have. So what we tried to do, and this is in a recent paper that I did with my colleague Michelle Gelfand at the University of Maryland, is try to identify some of the barriers to forgiveness in organizations and how that could be addressed at the cultural level. So what we argue is that we really need to start changing the cultures of organizations to help make forgiveness more acceptable. So one of the first concerns that people have with bringing forgiveness into organizations is that it's going to make people seem weak or powerless. So people are going to think I'm a doormat if I forgive people after they harm me. And so what we say one solution here is to bring compassion into the organization. And so we've heard a lot of different ways that you can do that. So like bringing the Make-A-Wish that Adam Grant had mentioned, mentorship programs. And so here I'm talking about changing the values of the company, changing the cultural values that define what the organization is all about. And if the idea of helping others, of relieving other people's suffering, starts becoming part of what the organization is all about, then all of a sudden forgiveness doesn't make you seem weak, it doesn't make you seem like a doormat. Instead, you're acting in a way that the organization expects you to act. And so even though forgiveness can be one of the hardest ways to express compassion, because it's against this person who's really harmed you, who's really hurt you, if you can build this culture of compassion and helping other people who are suffering, it can actually make forgiveness more possible. And no longer are people going to be concerned of what are people going to think about me if I forgive. Rather, they're going to say that, hey, by forgiving, I'm really part of what this company is all about. One of the second concerns, one of the things that makes forgiveness difficult is that it can actually take a lot of time. So initial reactions to conflict are often antisocial. When somebody harms us, we start feeling really upset, really vengeful and angry. And so what we argue here is that you need to practice temperance. So I do some consulting in healthcare companies, organizations, and recently I was talking to two employees who had gotten so upset with each other so quickly, they were nurses, they started arguing and yelling at each other in front of a patient while the patient was lying in the bed about the right treatment. And you don't know what you're talking about, and you're incompetent, and you can imagine how that made that patient feel, probably not very good. So one of the things that you need to do for effective forgiveness is to actually take a step back and engage in self-control, patience, restraint, and then that enables you to address the conflict more over a longer period of time. So what we argue here is that you actually need to bring ideas like mindfulness and meditation into the workplace. Mindfulness and awareness of the present moment, meditation, self-control, and start practicing this idea of not responding to things immediately, but rather being able to take a step back from that moment, engage in, again, what we call temperance, and that can help facilitate this process of forgiveness as well, rather than engaging in a conflict spiral where somebody harms me, I become immediately upset, I say something even worse back, and then that just keeps spiraling out of control until eventually somebody has to leave that organizational unit. So practicing compassion, practicing temperance. And then the final issue here is that forgiveness lets people off the hook. So there's this idea that forgiveness and justice are completely separate things. And if I forgive, basically what I'm doing is I'm giving up the opportunity for justice. What we argue here is that it depends on the type of justice that you're thinking about. So typically in the United States, we think about justice in what we call retributive justice, like a criminal justice system where you achieve balance in the relationship by bringing down the offender, by tearing them down and punishing them. But rather, there's this other way that you can think about justice, which is restorative justice. So rather than thinking about restoring balance by taking somebody down, you focus on shared values of the organization. And so you actually bring the victim, the offender, community members together and actually give everybody an opportunity to voice their perspective, what they're talking about. And so you can actually develop new conflict resolution programs in organizations, dispute resolution systems, focusing more on this restorative notion of let's affirm the shared values of the organization, talk about why this conflict occurred, and bring justice that way rather than through punishing the offender. Because chances are if you punish that offender, the victim and the offender aren't going to be best friends the next day if the offender just got chastised. So in terms of building this, again, this organizational system for forgiveness, we think you really need to change the values of the organization. You need to emphasize this compassion, the temperance, and this restorative notion of justice. And then despite all the difficulties associated with forgiving and sort of the heat of the moment when this person has offended you and you're so upset and so angry, that forgiveness can actually occur. So there's been some really good work by Kim Cameron, who was here, and others on forgiveness in the healthcare industry. I just wanted to provide one example. Michigan Health Systems, who has actually instituted an apology program, where it used to be that if there was medical error, then there would be just denying culpability, and the doctors would never apologize to patients for anything that possibly had gone wrong. And Michigan Health Systems said, well, let's change this around a little bit, and let's actually try to say, well, sometimes we can apologize, and it's okay to say that we did something wrong. Let's talk about forgiveness and try to bring this more pro-social conflict management strategy, and let's see what happens. And remarkably, they found incredibly successful effects by bringing more of this apology-focused approach to conflict management. They found that it actually cut litigation costs by $2 million per year, and medical liabilities claimed 40%. And this program has been so successful that similar programs are now being enacted in hospital systems throughout the country. So there's just one example of how bringing forgiveness into organizations actually can have a positive effect on the bottom line in doing things like reducing litigation and liability claims. And so thank you very much. That's all I have.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. I'm Sally Maitlis, and I have to say that I nearly didn't come here today because I was at Vancouver Airport yesterday. Having my little meeting with the U.S. immigration officer, and he said, "What is the purpose of your visit?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to a conference on compassion in business." And he looked at me and he said, "There is none." There, I've saved you a trip. But I came anyway, and I'm very glad to be here. I want to start off just by acknowledging and introducing you to the Compassion Lab, which Monica mentioned in my introduction. It's a wonderful group of organizational scholars who've worked together for over a decade studying compassion in organizations and seeing compassion as the collective response to pain and seeing organizations as sites where healing can occur. And I'm just showing you this. This is our website. This is the link to it. All our research is on here and a number of other resources, including this latest one, which was led by Monica. It's a quiz which allows you to see how compassionate your organization is, or an organization you're working with is or isn't. So all of this will be available, and I'd encourage you to go and check it out. But what I want to talk about today is at the team level, and I want to do that because teams are so prevalent in organizations, and they're so important to organizational health that it really seems worth spending some time on them. And an effective team is one where individuals are thriving and organizations are benefiting from them. But even the most effective teams have their times when things don't go so well. They miss a milestone, there might be some conflict within, and things start to go downhill. And I want to talk about how we can use care and compassion in teams to really bring them back to health and even take them beyond that, help them to flourish. My argument is that care in organizations is not just the responsibility of caring people who are nice, or even of carers, of managers whose job it is to make sure that people are doing okay, or even of HR departments with all their admirable policies to try to look after employees. But the caring is really a set of practices that take place amongst ordinary organizational members, and that through these practices they can change how they understand themselves and how they understand what they're capable of. And through that, they can really change what they do in organizations. So I'm drawing here on work that I've been doing with Tom Lawrence at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, where we're trying to unpack what does care look like as a set of practices amongst members of an organization. And we're focusing in particular on the kinds of conversations that people have and the kinds of conversations that people have in teams that can really transform how they act. When we look across a wide range of literature on individuals, groups, even families and societies who are struggling, we find that often what keeps them stuck are the way they understand and talk about themselves in three broad areas. The experiences they've had, their sort of shared history, the problems that they are dealing with, and the future that they foresee. And when we study what allows them to move forward, to get unstuck and to take action, we find they talk about themselves in very different ways in these three domains. And this is certainly also true of work teams, who may be doing extremely well, but still have these times when things go wrong for them, and they can become very stuck in where they are. So I want to introduce you to three kinds of conversations, one in each of these areas, drawing on the literature on care and compassion in organizations, and help you see how these can make a real difference to teams. So let's think of a team that's struggling. Probably we've all been in one at one time or another. But I'm going to give you a hypothetical example. Here's a team. They've worked together very successfully over several months. They began very well, but over time, things have begun to decline a little bit. They missed a couple of key milestones. They had a difficult time retaining a client. Then somebody left the team. People looked inwards. They began to blame each other. They began to feel they were very unproductive. And things began to spiral downhill. So how does this team talk about its history? Well, much as I have just done, focusing on its problems and its failures, and often globalizing and feeling this is how we've always been, and this is how we're always going to be. This is who we are. But when we look at the literature on care and compassion, and particularly appreciative inquiry, we see there's a very different way of talking about teams talking about their history that can make an enormous difference. And it's this. It's that if teams begin to talk about themselves not as a sequence of problems and failures, but to identify sparkling moments, and these are positive events in the team's history that need not be heroic, extraordinary things that have happened. They could be quite taken for granted, mundane moments that are lost in all the concern about the problems and the failings. But that when they are pulled out and ordered, begin to change the flavor of the history. They're brought into the foreground of this team's conversation, and they begin to notice, yes, there are these times when actually we hit a deadline, and there are times when we had a really good meeting. And you know what? There was even that time when we just went out and we had a great evening together, and we all remember that we get on. This is a history of sparkling moments. But a key piece of this is not just telling yourself a story about how great you are, but noticing that it's not just luck that created this history. It's recognizing team members' contributions to creating this history. So it's recognizing the commitments and the abilities and the other qualities of team members which have allowed these positive events, these sparkling moments to occur. And it's so imbuing this history with a different kind of meaning. Through this, the team is building appreciation for themselves. But not just for themselves. The idea of this practice is you share it with other people. You help make your story, make your history richer by building in other people's experiences of your team and adding to the complexity of the history in that way. And that when teams do this, they build team potency. They build a collective belief in their ability to perform. And they do this because they've made salient to themselves their individual and their collective competence. And that they've reminded themselves their demonstrated ability to work together. And they've also created positive emotion, which is a very important force in itself. So this is one kind of conversations that teams can have that is a caring conversation that allows them to rebuild themselves. Okay. Let me talk about problems, team problems. So all teams talk about problems, that's perfectly natural, but a team that is struggling begins to identify with its problems. It begins to define itself in its problems. So that team I was introducing you to, they might begin to say, we are not productive, we are uncreative, we are always late. Yeah? And this is a very restrictive way of talking about yourself. And we know from the field of narrative therapy that when individuals do this, it's very problematic. When a client presents as anorexic or as depressed, this begins to really constrain who they are and who they can be. And it's exactly the same in the team setting. So a caring conversation that makes a difference here is one that involves contextualizing the problems the team's having. And this is about recognizing that most problems have roots in the broader sociocultural context. Most problems are manufactured over a long period of time. And I'm not saying, and teams should not be saying, this has nothing to do with us, and it's about blaming other people and putting the responsibility outside. It's just about recognizing that problems have multiple sources, and the team is one of those sources. And this allows them to separate from the problem and to tackle it jointly, to tackle it together. So you could think of a team that is seeing itself as always failing to achieve its results, and it may accept that, but it begins to see that it's doing this in a industry context of very rapid timelines and of less concern for lasting customer relationships. Now, that may be the core value of the team, and they're up against that. Just allowing them to recognize those different influences helps them to see themselves and talk about their problems differently. So when a team does this, it builds its agency. It helps itself to see that it's very resourceful in being able to overcome these problems. It sees the influence of the context on the problem, and it allows it to emotionally dissociate from the problems it's dealing with, and to construct a common enemy that then they can join together to tackle. Okay, so that's the second kind of conversation. And the third and final conversation I'm going to talk about in terms of talking with greater care in your team concerns talking about the future. And if you think about a team you know which is struggling, it tends to talk in very hopeless ways. Yeah? It doesn't see a good future. And at this point, just setting goals is not very helpful. It's not very motivational because they feel impossible. Yeah? And people in the team may not even feel they have job security. So the future is this sort of dangerous, depressing place that people talk about as a very hopeless situation. But if these teams can accept some of the uncertainty that is inevitable, and if they can begin to think about how they could harness their own potential and fulfill their own capacity, this can really change the kind of conversation they have. And so the idea of this third caring practice is to move away from very constraining, very, very narrow conversations about specific goals that may feel impossible, to tell stories, open-ended stories of the future that allow people to think in broader terms about the goals they're trying to achieve and how they might achieve them. And so an example of this might be our team who has a goal of progress, but progress includes all sorts of things. It includes developing a new prototype, identifying a new client, perhaps even managing to clarify their roles and responsibilities in a better way. And it acknowledges that there are contradictions within this, that these things there may be tensions between these different meanings of a goal, but that's okay, because all of these future stories are really works in progress that are going to be revisited and revised as the future unfolds. So telling these kinds of open-ended stories about the future builds transcendent hope, and this is different hope from concrete hope that we will meet this particular goal or milestone. It's an image of the future that's positive but uncertain. And open-ended stories of the future build this transcendent hope by energizing people, by giving them a feeling that something is possible and creating a positive image and suggesting different outcomes that can be part of that image and different paths that you can take to get there. So these are my three take-home points from this talk. I'm trying to show you that caring and compassion are sets of learned practices that really anybody in organizations can do. You don't need a facilitator, you don't need an intervention, you need to change the way you talk to each other, and this will change your understandings of each other and of your abilities, and therefore it will change what you actually can do together. And I haven't had time to say much about this today, but the kinds of organizational contexts that enable this kind of conversation are less bureaucratic structures, more network-type structures that give people the autonomy to move towards each other and allow integration across levels between different groups of people. And we've heard about culture already this morning, but cultures of trust that really value humanity and value the wholeness of the person at work. It allows people to be vulnerable and to step in to talk about themselves and their troubles in a very different kind of way. Thank you.
If you have a question for our panel, please move to one of the microphones in the aisleway. And while we're letting you adjust, I had asked our panel members to think about this idea of the compassionate organization and to think about one key question, unanswered question, or maybe even a piece of work that they're doing in the future that would help illuminate this notion of a compassionate organization, which I think we don't really understand that well. We're just setting off on the path to understand what that would mean. So since we're the compassionate organizational panel, what are your thoughts about those key questions? And no pressure to have an answer.
You're looking over here. Well, something that we see quite frequently in human resources management selection is that there's a tight focus on competencies, knowledge, skills, and abilities, or other characteristics that are used to pre-select people into the organization. This is wonderful, and some of our other panelists have talked about things like organizational citizenship behavior, which is fantastic, but I don't see any work being done in trying to really establish criteria that would be useful in terms of pre-employment selection, and then training people in these kinds of approaches so they can bring this kind of approach to organizations, knowing full well that it's making a huge contribution in terms of things like productivity. So that's one place to start.
Anyone else have any key questions for Jody?
I do, and I think we've got some insights I've got some insights from the other panelists about answers to these questions. One of the questions I've often had is how to turn around a negative cycle, a downward kind of spiral, because we can see the positive relationships and outcomes so nicely correlated, across organizations, but how do you get from down here to up there? And I just thought there were a couple of great insights there. One of the insights is you don't necessarily do it just by introducing new structures. That's not necessarily the point of intervention, that a relational intervention can be more the turning point. And so these kind of forgiveness behaviors and creating the new conversations could be in that kind of toolkit that I've been thinking about a lot, and actually talking with one of my colleagues at Shine about what is that relational kind of micro change in the relational patterns that can be the turning point for an organization, in large or small. And I think these are some great insights, and I'm hoping to get even more today.
Thank you. One of the things I'm deeply hopeful about is that this kind of conference and this kind of conversation brings together Steve's presentation of the compassionate organization as reaching outward into its community and via its strategy, with people who are studying the inward practices, and that we build that entire picture and take the spiral upward and outward. Mm-hmm. Questions from our audience?
Look, I have a question. Okay. How does sex play into this? Okay. How do women, okay, you guys are all talking about guys and girls working together, but nobody's talking about sex. So I'd like to hear what that does.
You mean gender? I'm just curious. We could take that
Wait,
differently.
Mandy, come back up here. We have to have a conversation about love. Love at work. Gender in compassion and organizations, anybody?
You don't focus on it? You don't look at it?
I mean, is this on?
It's on.
So I don't know of anybody who's done a study, a comparative study of compassion in the two genders. I know that in some of our work in the lab, we ended up studying organizations that were predominantly women, and a lot of the questions we got were, is this just, a woman thing? Women being nice and caring. But in this work that I've been doing with Tom Lawrence, we're saying, these are really very fundamentally feminist principles that aren't about being a woman. They're about having ever cared for anybody, having ever been cared for as a child, and about recognizing that everybody's vulnerable, everybody is struggling, and everybody does better when they're cared for, as we all did as children. And that these are something that, men and women are equally capable of doing, and I think are doing much more in this generation than previously.
Thank you.
If I could just add on to that, my colleagues and I recently did a meta-analysis of the forgiveness literature. You combine all of the studies, and we found that there weren't actually any gender differences in tendencies to forgive, which I think echoes the idea that it can be something that can apply quite broadly.
The panel has given us a lot of really good examples of companies doing wonderful things. One of my questions is, I would consider education a business. It's a global business. If you look at the money, if you look at the numbers, there's a lot of money that flows in and out. And in my career, because I'm much older than Dan, I've been a management consultant, a banker, and I've worked as a head of organizational development for a university, and I've worked for a large charitable foundation. And the last two were the meanest, nastiest, most hierarchical, least compassionate, and organizations where different people's voices simply didn't matter. So I'd love to hear if anyone's been researching the university sector.
Ryan, do you know distribution of forgiveness across industries or anything like that? Not in your meta-analysis. Huh?
No.
I fear that many of us can speak to this as embedded, journalists, but other than that, I haven't. But it is an interesting kind of issue because people strive to be at the heights of their academic careers. It's no surprise that there's very little space in rooms with lots of academicians because the heads are so large, and other perspectives are oftentimes not heard. I would be interested in seeing that research, though.
I guess I would just concur that I see some of the same fragmentation and hierarchy, and that in academia, particularly higher education, that we see in some areas of medicine, and the two are tightly tied. I don't think it's been studied enough. I want to point to one of my colleagues, Charles Heckscher, who has been writing with Paul Adler about collaborative community. He's just putting together a kind of a series of essays on relational dynamics and collaborative community and so on in the higher education sector. So it looks like it certainly warrants attention. I remember when I first came to interview at Brandeis University when I was entering what I think is a wonderful university, the dean said, "Can you please tell us how to apply these concepts here and now?" And I think it may be hard for us as academics being so embedded in this context to be able to reflect on it and be as helpful as we might be to other industries. And it's a shame because I think it's worthy of attention.
And as we develop more of these measures and use them more widely, these are the kinds of questions I think we can begin to answer. On this side.
Yes. Has any research been done in the area of offshoring and compassionate organizations? Because I find that a bit of a sort of a paradox there, that you quite happily cut your jobs locally and offshore them, and then have a strong social responsibility program and think you're doing good in the industry.
Offshoring, we may have some experts this afternoon that have more to say about that, but no one on our particular panel. And I'm glad I introduced the idea of unanswered questions. I had the intuition that we have lots of unanswered questions about the compassionate organization. Thank you for raising it. This side?
It's loud. I'm just thinking about Mondragon. I don't know if anyone knows about it. It's a complete cooperative city, really, where everyone in the city, they own the businesses, the universities, the whole factories, everything. And like if they have a problem with finances, with sales, with a company, then they'll all agree, okay, we'll take so much less work so that no one is actually put off work, and they have a really interesting cooperative. So I'm just wondering about, we're talking about business and compassion, the study of those kinds of cooperative models of living that try to embody as their fundamental bottom line that living compassion. And I see that you have a lot of head shaking.
Yeah, I've always been interested in worker ownership, and the Mondragon community is a very long-standing success story in northern Spain. So I know there's a lot of study of employee ownership, but I don't know if it's been approached from the angle that we are sharing today. So I think it's a huge area of potential, and I think we're setting out some new research agendas, I think, based on the questions that you're raising today, rather than maybe having answers where you're giving some wonderful questions. Others? Yeah.
There is some work that's somewhat relevant on family businesses that suggests that when you have these close multiplex ties where everybody knows each other and they're friends and also coworkers, et cetera, that these issues of compassion and forgiveness start becoming a lot more salient. And so we've seen some sort of qualitative work coming out recently in the family business talking about how that's important as well.
Actually, we'll go ahead and take this
Time for one more.
Since I looked at her and shook my head, so I feel compelled to be compassionate.
You get the privilege of the last question.
Thank you. As I've been listening to the speakers this morning, a consistent question that has gone through my mind is around size. Has there been any research as we think about implementing some of these kind of compassion instilling techniques in our organization? How should we be thinking about size of the teams to maximize the effectiveness of some of these techniques, ranging from Adam's comment on this reciprocity idea. I mean, if you think about doing that in a room of 300, it seems like, oh my gosh, my brain can't think about 300 people's wishes, to the last presentation we heard about teams. How should we be thinking about size to maximize the effects of these techniques?
It probably depends what it is exactly you want to try. And, obviously teams, you're going to have these kinds of conversations. You don't want to have enormous teams of people who hardly know each other. It's about having meaningful relationships, as we heard right at the beginning of the morning, that allow people to come forward and talk about themselves differently. With the reciprocity ring, I haven't done that, but I think it has been done with very large numbers of people. Success. I don't know if Adam's in here still. Okay, so Kim is saying...
Thousands online.
Yeah. So there isn't. It may feel overwhelming, but actually, it can be very successful. So it really depends what you're doing. If you're trying to change the structure or culture of an organization, then you're working at the organizational level. If you're trying to change things in small pockets of departments, start there. But I don't think there's an easy answer to that. What size works.
I think on that note, we're going to take a break. We're running a little bit behind time. I want to thank our panelists and Monica for the excellent moderation.